Picture this. You are the richest man in the entire world. Every person in your kingdom bows when your shadow crosses their path. And yet, you are terrified of dying. Not because you fear death itself, but because you fear what comes after it if your body is not ready. So, you make a decision that will define the rest of your life. You decide to build a mountain of stone that will outlast every king who ever lived, every war that will ever be fought, and every civilization that will ever rise after yours. You decide to build a pyramid. It sounds like an act of pure faith. But strip away the gold and the religion, and what you actually have is one of the largest business operations in human history. Feeding, housing, paying, and managing tens of thousands of workers for decades, using nothing but grain, beer, and bureaucracy. No banks, no paper money, no email to organize a single person. And somehow, it worked so well that the result is still standing 4,500 years later, while empires that came after it have crumbled into dust. So how do you actually afford to build a pyramid? Not spiritually, financially. Where does a king in the desert, with no coins and no global trade network, find the resources to move 7 million tons of stone? Let's follow the money, or rather, follow the bread, the beer, and the barley, because in ancient Egypt, that is what money looked like. The first thing you need to understand is that Egypt did not have currency the way we think of it. There were no coins jingling in anyone's pocket. The entire economy ran on what economists call an in-kind system. You paid people with things they could actually eat, wear, or use. Grain was the real currency. Bread and beer were the two most common forms of payment for regular workers, because both could be made from the same barley and wheat that flooded in from the harvest every year. This matters, because it means the pharaoh's real wealth was not gold sitting in a vault. His wealth was land, and the harvest that land produced, and the loyalty of the people who worked it. Building a pyramid was really an exercise in converting one year's harvest into permanent stone. Now, for a long time, the story people told was simple and dramatic. Slaves, whips, a cruel king forcing broken men to drag stone under the desert sun until they died. It made for a good movie. It made for a terrible economic model, and it also happens to be wrong. When archaeologists actually dug into the ground south of the pyramids in the 1980s, they found something nobody expected. They found an entire town, streets, bakeries, breweries, barracks, even a cemetery for the workers themselves, with real names carved into the tombs. This wasn't a prison camp. This was closer to a fully functioning company town, built to run one of the most demanding construction projects the world had ever seen. So, who actually built the thing? The workforce was split into two very different groups, and understanding the difference is the key to understanding the whole economic machine. At the top, you had a smaller group of permanent, highly skilled craftsmen. These were the stonemasons, the engineers, the men who understood how to cut and place blocks with a precision that still confuses modern architects. They lived at the site year-round, and because their skill was rare, they were paid better and treated better than anyone else on the project. Below them was a much larger, rotating workforce of ordinary farmers, and this is where the real genius of the operation shows up. Egypt's entire agricultural calendar depended on the Nile River flooding every year. For several months, the fields were completely underwater, and farmers had nothing to do. No planting, no harvesting, just idle hands during exactly the season when the state needed the most labor to move stone. So the government essentially borrowed the farming population during their unemployed season, worked them for a few months, and gave them back before the water receded and it was time to plant again. It was not slavery. It was closer to a national seasonal jobs program, except the paycheck was a full stomach and a place to sleep instead of a coin, and the food itself tells you just how seriously the state took this operation. This wasn't a starvation diet designed to keep men just barely alive. Archaeologists studying the animal bones left behind at the workers' town estimate that close to 2 tons of meat, cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered every single day just to feed this workforce. Add bakeries producing thousands of loaves of bread daily, legumes for extra protein, and beer by the barrel, and you get a diet that was frankly better than what the average Egyptian farmer ate back home in his own village. Why would a king spend so heavily on feeding people who were, in the grand scheme, replaceable labor? Because a well-fed worker moves more stone per day than a starving one, and a workforce that associates the project with good food and fair treatment doesn't need to be dragged there by force. This is basic labor economics. 4,500 years before anyone wrote a textbook on it. Happy, healthy workers are more productive workers, and the state understood that instinctively. There's also something almost touching hidden in the bones of these workers. Archaeologists found skeletons with broken limbs that had healed cleanly, set properly, the way a modern doctor would set them. They even found evidence of skull surgery that the patient survived. This tells us the operation had doctors on site, ready to treat injuries from a job that was, without question, dangerous. Men fell from ramps, men were crushed under stone. Dust from cutting limestone destroyed lungs over the years, and the state's answer to all of that risk was not to simply replace the injured man with a fresh one from the fields. It was to treat him and, where possible, get him back to work. Because training a skilled stonecutter takes years, and years cost more than medicine. Now let's talk about the actual stone, because this is where the scale of the project becomes almost impossible to comprehend. The Great Pyramid alone contains roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone, with a total weight estimated at around 7 billion kilograms. Most of that stone was quarried close to the site itself, which was a deliberate cost-saving decision. Why pay to transport material from far away when you are sitting on a plateau made of the exact limestone you need? But the finer, whiter casing stones that once covered the entire pyramid and made it shine like a jewel in the sun, those came from quarries across the river and had to be ferried over by boat during the Nile floods, then dragged the rest of the way on wooden sledges over wetted sand to reduce friction. Every one of those steps required labor, wood, rope, and time, and every one of those steps had to be planned years in advance by a government that had never built anything on this scale before. If you try to put a modern price tag on all this labor, the numbers get almost absurd. Researchers who have calculated the total man-hours required to build the Great Pyramid, using conservative modern wages just as a comparison tool, arrive at figures in the billions of dollars, just for the labor, before you even count the cost of feeding, housing, and organizing everyone. And remember, this was one project among several. Multiple pharaohs built multiple pyramids, some of them false starts that collapsed, or were abandoned halfway through. Imagine spending years and an enormous share of the kingdom's harvest on a monument, only to watch its outer casing crack under its own weight and have to start over completely. That happened more than once. Ambition in ancient Egypt was not cheap, and it was not guaranteed to succeed. So where did the actual resources to fund all this come from, if there was no tax collector showing up with a bag of coins? The answer is a mix of land ownership, tribute, and control. The pharaoh technically owned all the land in Egypt. Every harvest that came off that land was, in a very real sense, his to redirect. On top of that, conquered territories and trading partners sent tribute, goods, timber, copper, sometimes even labor, flowing into the royal storehouses. This gave the crown an enormous surplus to work with, far beyond what any single household or town could produce. Building a pyramid was essentially the government identifying its single largest asset, a massive agricultural surplus combined with near-total control over the population's labor, and spending years converting that surplus into a permanent structure that would outlive the harvest, outlive the king, and outlive the entire dynasty. And here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. This entire system, run without money, without contracts, without anything close to modern accounting, was organized well enough to produce a structure that remained the tallest man-made object on Earth for roughly 3,800 years. Not decades, not centuries, 3,800 years. No skyscraper, no cathedral, no monument built anywhere else on the planet came close to matching its height until the industrial age arrived with iron and steel. Think about what that actually means. A civilization with no currency, no writing system as advanced as ours, and tools made largely of copper and stone, outbuilt almost every empire that came after it. For nearly 4 millennia. Was it worth it? Depends who you ask. If you were the pharaoh, absolutely, because your entire worldview said that surviving into the afterlife depended on it, and the pyramid was proof to your people that your rule was blessed and powerful enough to command the impossible. If you were a farmer conscripted for a few months during flood season, maybe you saw it differently, as steady food, a roof, medical care, and purpose during a season when you'd otherwise have nothing to do. And if you were an economist looking back thousands of years later, you'd probably call it one of the most sophisticated resource allocation projects the ancient world ever managed to pull off, run entirely on grain, bread, beer, and the simple fact that a government controlling its people's labor during their idle season can build almost anything given enough time. The pyramids were never really about stone. They were about a system, one that figured out how to turn a river's flood cycle, a nation's surplus grain, and a rotating army of seasonal labor into the closest thing humans have ever built to eternity. And it's still standing there in the desert today, quietly reminding every visitor that long before spreadsheets, before banks, before a single coin was ever minted in Egypt, someone had already solved the hardest problem in economics. How do you convince tens of thousands of people to spend years of their lives building something they will never personally need?